I can remember so powerfully the days my children were born, and especially the days my twin boys were born, because I can't believe they allowed me to do this, but they allowed me right after their birth to take both of them wrapped up. I had one in each arm, and we had a lobby full of people there kind of cheering us on, and I can remember coming out from the back with one in each arm, and it was just a rush of adrenaline and excitement, like euphoria that I've never ever experienced. And there was poor Sherry in the back in agony and pain. She didn't get to experience any of that, and it really is the beginning of the path of motherhood, isn't it? I mean, mothers are so much in the background, and yet they are our backbone, our strength, just doing so much behind the scenes. So we want to just have one day here where we thank you. If you are a mother, will you please stand and let us thank you. The first holy thing in all creation. The first holy thing in all creation was not a person or a people or a place. It was a day. A day. That great divine myth in the book of Genesis tells us that God made everything in creation and called it good. But when God rested on the seventh day, God called it holy, making the Sabbath the first sacred thing in all creation. Theologian and philosopher Rabbi Abraham Hester said that makes the seventh day a palace in time into which human beings are invited every single week of our lives. A palace in time. In the 1960s, we had many blue laws in Savannah. Most places of business could not be open on Sundays. As a child, this saddened me, frustrated me. I thought it was ridiculous. Yet now I yearn for those days, as Sundays have taken on the very same characteristics of every other day in the week. Same rehearsals, same practices, same classes, same store sales, jobs, games. I hadn't realized the importance of Sabbath. I didn't realize it was a palace in time. It sure didn't seem like a palace in time to me back then. I had to button the top button of my shirt and wear a tie, and sometimes even a coat. What little boy likes to do that? Then you had to sit silently on a hard pew, on a piece of wood, and listen to a minister hem and haw for 20 to 30 minutes about something you did not understand. I knew it was a commandment, something we had to do. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Keep it holy. I heard the voice of Charlton Heston saying, "Do it or you'll be in trouble." And for those of you who are too young to know who Charlton Heston was, he was an actor with a rich baritone voice who was known for playing many biblical characters, especially Moses. For many of us, if not for most of us who were brought up in the church, the Sabbath was something we did so we would not get in trouble with God. It was an offering to God. It wasn't until I got much older that I began to see the Sabbath as an offering from God to us. And that's what Jesus said it is. The Sabbath was made for people, he said one day, and not people for the Sabbath. That is, the Sabbath was designed to help us to be healthy and whole. The word Sabbath comes from the Hebrew word Shabbat, which means to stop, to cease. Sometimes I add to prune. The 14th century theologian Meister Eckhart said, God is not found in the soul by adding anything, but by subtracting. Subtracting. It's no wonder that keeping Sabbath is difficult for us, because stopping, ceasing, subtracting are not positive words for us. We are conditioned to be active and productive. That's how we tend to consider our worth, by how much we have, by how much we do, by how much we can attain. Henry David Thoreau said, most of the luxuries and many of the so-called comforts of life are not only not indispensable, but hindrances to the elevation of humankind. Our life is frittered away by detail. He says, simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. I say, let your affairs be as 2 or 3, and not as 100 of 1,000. Instead of 1,000,000, count half a dozen, and keep your accounts on your thumbnail. Those words were written in the 1800s. Can you imagine what Thoreau would say today? But he reminds us that people have always struggled with this. I imagine that's why the Jewish scribes wrote so many laws about not doing anything on the Sabbath. We look at all of those rules and they seem silly to us. We say that they went overboard. I mean, crazy with it. But my hunch is that people kept finding ways to work during Sabbath. They kept finding ways to beat the system, kept finding reasons to do things, and so the scribes kept writing more and more rules, trying to counter people's addiction to activity and production. And I imagine this addiction goes all the way back to the ancient days when people believed in many gods. Because if you had a lot of things back then, you believed that the gods were happy with you. And if you didn't have a lot of things, if your crops died, or if you had a child die, then the gods were not happy with you. In fact, the gods were punishing you. And so we have it in our mindset that attaining things is good for us. It makes us feel good. But Meister Eckhart reminds us that's not how it works. God is not found in the soul by adding anything, but by subtracting. Karl Barth, the great Swiss theologian, said, "A being is free only when it can determine and limit its activity. The paradox of freedom, right? A being is free only when it can determine and limit its activity. Wayne Dyer used to like to say, the thing that makes music so beautiful, the thing that makes music so powerful and meaningful, are the rest, the pauses. Franciscan Richard Rohr says, in our busy, technology-driven culture, it is especially important that we intentionally seek rest and recreation. The creation story might be saying that at least 1/7 of life must be about non-performance and non-egocentric pursuits, or we forget our life's purpose. And then my favorite quote, in fact, it's a paragraph. It's in her book, An Altar in the World. Barbara Brown Taylor writes this, and I must say that this is one of the finest paragraphs I've ever read in a book. She writes, at least one day in every 7, pull off the road and park the car in the garage. Close the door to the tool shed and turn off the computer. Stay home not because you are sick, but because you are well. Talk someone you love into being well with you. Take a nap, a walk, an hour for lunch. Test the premise that you are worth more than what you can produce. That even if you spent one whole day being good for nothing, you would still be precious in God's sight. And when you get anxious because you are convinced that this is not so, remember that your own conviction is not required. This is a commandment. Your worth has already been established, even when you are not working. The purpose of the commandment is to woo you to the same truth. Wow. An Altar in the World, Barbara Brown Taylor. And so Sabbath is about our health, our happiness, our wholeness. The Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. Sabbath is God's offering to us, a gift. Now, every time I read today's text from the book of Acts about the Apostle Paul's journey to Greece, I think of my daughter Chelsea spending 6 weeks in Greece during her college years, and she was our oldest and the first to go overseas, and you know how Sherry and I were feeling. And I'll never forget the first time we spoke to Chelsea after she got situated in her new surroundings. And she said that one of the adjustments that was difficult for her was the pace. She said in that culture, there seemed to be no timetable, no deadlines, no rushing. Everything, she said, is done very deliberately. Preparing a meal, she said, can easily take several hours. And so for the first time, Chelsea realized how busy we all are as she was given this opportunity, given this time to think and process things, or to simply be. And so when Paul makes this trip, he leaves Jerusalem, he goes north a bit, and then over to the west into Asia Minor, which is present-day Turkey. He plans to spend a lot of time there making converts, starting congregations, but things don't go as planned. They don't work out for him, and he needs a plan B. and he feels led to go further west. He crosses into Europe, into Greece. Now, how did Paul get the notion to change plans and go to Europe? The text says it happened when he was still. When he was being still, when he was quiet, when he was having a Sabbath moment and he had a vision. He felt God wanting him to do something, and he followed this nudging. Now, when Paul arrives in Greece, he goes to the town of Philippi, and you know what he wants to do? He wants to keep Sabbath. So even though he's far from home, even though he's in a strange land and in a different culture, he still makes sure to keep Sabbath. Remember, it's one of the commandments. It's right there with do not kill, you know. So he goes to a spot outside of the city gate where he hears that people like to gather to pray. And while he is there, he meets a woman named Lydia. And Lydia is described as a seller of purple goods. And she sounds like a phenomenal person. She sounds like she was, especially in that time and that culture, quite a business person and quite a spirit. This Gentile woman becomes Paul's first convert in Europe that we know about. And this is where the church in Philippi begins. It's this congregation he's writing to with his letter to the Philippians. And it all happened because Paul was keeping Sabbath. This new experience all started with Paul being still and being open to the movement of God's Spirit. And so the Sabbath is not just for our rest and renewal, it's also for inspiration and guidance. It helps us know to move from plan A to plan B and to plan C and D. It helps us keep our hearts and minds open and fertile for the Spirit, for the movement of the Spirit. Another thing that is interesting about today's story from the book of Acts is that it starts with Paul going to this new land and trying to find a place to keep Sabbath. But then the story shifts to being about a relationship. Paul meets Lydia. She too had gone to a place of prayer where she met Paul. She believed in God or some higher power, and after hearing about Christ and his teachings, she wants to be baptized. She wants to strive to follow his way of living, and she even invites Paul to come to her house. The Catholic Church has given Lydia sainthood. The Orthodox Church has deemed Saint Lydia equal to the apostles. Wow. And as I've mentioned, she was the first known Christian convert in Europe and the main force for the church in Philippi. And so I'm reminded that the blessing of Sabbath and the movement of God's Spirit not only comes to us during times of stillness and prayer, but also comes to us in and through community, through relationships, through the people we encounter, especially the people who are also seeking Sabbath, like Paul and Lydia were, seeking to grow spiritually, the people who share with us at the 10 o'clock hour, the people we sit by during worship, the people we meet at coffee hour, the folks who have a conversation with us in the parking lot. God takes these encounters, blesses them, and new life begins, new adventures. A big part of the Sabbath experience, a big part of the Sabbath blessing of health and wholeness has to do with community. with being in relationship with others. You've all heard the old story about the minister who could never get the one guy who lived up on a mountain to church. And the minister made the journey to the place, went in to be with the man, didn't know quite what to say. In fact, he didn't say much. But he went over to the fireplace where there was a roaring fire burning, took the poker, and nudged one coal away from the fire. And you know the rest. It burned out. I read somewhere that to observe the seventh day does not mean merely to obey or to conform to the strictness of a divine commandment. To observe the Sabbath is to celebrate the creation of the world and to create the seventh day all over again. And so let us remember that the Sabbath is a gift for us, an offering from God, a blessing to lead us to healing, to wholeness, to renewal, to relationships, to wild adventures. And so let us take advantage of it. Let us continue to create the seventh day time and time again. Amen and amen.